Welcome to this edition to the NAFI 10 Question Challenge, the online video series where we interview and ask 10 questions to current and former flight instructors who have made a name for themselves in the industry and leveraged their flight instructor experience for professional success. My name is John Niehaus. I'll be your host today. I'm the Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors, and I'm so pleased to welcome my guest today, Greg Brown. Greg has been a flight instructor since 1979, which equates to about 41 years of experience. He's a CFI, II, MEI. He was Flight Instructor of the Year in the year 2000, the first accredited NAFI Master Flight Instructor. He runs the Greg Brown Student Pilot Pep Talk group on Facebook. He was the columnist for AOPA Flight Training magazine for his column, The Greg Brown Flying Carpet. And he is an author for ASA under the ASA publication umbrella and has written several books, including the Savvy Flight Instructor. Greg, welcome.
Thank you for having me today, John.
Oh, I'm so excited. And with normal fashion, we'll just jump straight into it. Was flight instruction part of your original career plan, or was it something you never anticipated doing?
I didn't seriously anticipate it. My dad was a flight instructor, so I had been exposed to it, and I admired him, of course, like most of us do of our parents. But I basically was one of those people that every time I felt like I needed to sharpen up my skills and I wanted to be better at piloting, that I would add a rating. When it came to the time, so I staggered through. I got my private in 72, my instrument in 77. But then once I got my commercial and the CFI, then I got excited and went on and got the other CFI ratings and immediately began instructing and have been immersed in it ever since.
It's amazing how addicting it can be once you start it.
It's true.
So reflecting on your instructor skill with your first student, how do you think you did?
Well, I don't remember specifically who that was. I do know that my wife was one of my first students, and I would not recommend trying to teach your spouse.
Oh, wow.
In fact, I'm going to mention that right up front. That's kind of a funny story. I got her through to solo, and she's a terrific pilot. She's glider rated. But there was a certain point where we were working on stalls, and we've all had this conversation with our students. Pull back, pull back, pull back. No. No, you just have to pull back a little. No, I won't do it. So that kind of ended that one student chapter with Gene. But no, seriously, in terms of the first student or two, I think I did pretty well because I was a faculty member at Purdue at the time. And so I was accustomed to teaching. And I think anyone who's taught previously is off to a good start flight instructing. They understand the basic principles of teaching. But the hard part to learn, and this wasn't my first student, but it was among my early students, was assessing a student's judgment is something that takes a lot of experience. Mm-hmm. So I had one student, I'll call him Ron, who I sent him off on his long cross country. And in those days, that was a 300-mile, 300-mile trip, and 150. And we discussed refueling at each of the different spots and so on. But I didn't hear from him when he returned that evening, which kind of upset me. I couldn't reach him. This was before cell phones. The next morning, I get a call from the flight school saying, hey, Greg, I just wanted to let you know that one of the airplanes that we were refueling was almost completely dry, and we wondered if it might have been one of your students.
Oh, no.
And I said, which airplane was it? And he said, the one with the dented wing.
Oh, no.
So it turned out that this fellow's mother was paying for his flying lessons. He was a Purdue student. I was doing this after hours. And I learned later when I talked to him, he suddenly realized that if he used his own credit card to pay for the fuel, then his mother might not reimburse him. So he did not refuel on the 300-mile cross country in a Cessna 150. So then I said, well, what's with the dented wing? And he told me that even though he had never refueled, he was taxiing around one of the airports on the trip looking for the fuel pump, and the wing hit a light pole.
Oh, no.
So that almost ended my career there. I mean, everybody was understanding, but I was so horrified at the risks involved and that someone would do something like that. that that's probably the one time in my entire flying career that I thought, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. Fortunately, I got past it. Anyway, long answer to a short question.
Sure. I mean, it's the nervousness that comes with sending a student solo, and frankly, even after you've been doing it for years, it's still that incredible pressure of, oh, I hope everything goes okay.
It's true. And will they rise to whatever occasion that they need to?
Exactly. So most of us have had an instructor mentor to help us learn the ropes. Who was yours, and what was the most meaningful thing they taught you?
Well, I'm going to share the words of a few mentors because I think the words are memorable. Okay. Sure. My primary instructor was Bob Vetter. This was in Madison, Wisconsin, way back. And one day we were flying in the pattern at Madison, and there were F-102s flying around still in those days, the Air National Guard. And he's like, oh, we're going to go out and practice stalls. So we went out there to do stalls. I was a primary student, of course. And while doing power on stalls, I didn't put enough rudder in, and we entered a spin. And Bob did something then which has stayed with me through all of these years as a fundamental part of how I view instructing. We're in a spin, right? The horizon's going around. Bob sat there like this with his arms crossed, and he looked at me and he just said, so Greg, what are you going to do? While we're spinning, and I don't know what to do. And so he talked me through the process probably several times, right? Because I was completely flipped out. And I recovered from the spin. He never touched the controls. Obviously, we had safe altitude, right? Sure. I mean, we were 3,000, 4,000 feet. But I never doubted my ability after that to recover from a spin all these years, right? Because he armed me to solve the problem. And I've never forgotten that. Another great mentor, I did my instrument instructor in a Purdue course, and I took my check ride with Mitch Grundman, who was the head of the flight program at Purdue at that time. Stern guy, but a great guy and a terrific instructor. And he told me a tip regarding instrument flying, which I've always remembered. When your student starts to get overloaded, which is the nature of instrument training, right?
Right.
Mitch told me there's only two things you need to know for instrument flying. The next two things. If your student can know what the next two things they're going to have to do are, cross this fix, make a radio call and turn right or whatever, and then they rearm themselves with the next, if they're always ahead by two things, they can do an acceptable job. It's not big picture, but it reduces workload a lot. So I found that to be a really valuable thing to tell students. Forget about the missed approach. It's 6 places down. At this instant, concentrate on the next two things. Okay. Mike Wiggins at Embry-Riddle did some research on transfer of learning. I won't go into it here, but the essence of it is to deliver no more than a few important points at a time because people can't absorb it. And that's covered in my Savvy Flight Instructor book in detail, what Mike taught me there. But I think it's something we all need to know is if we can condense the meat of the lesson into a few points they must remember and not overwhelm them, they're much more likely to remember it. There's a thread to all these, which will come out in a later question here, but Fred Gibbs here at Flagstaff, he's ex-FAA, he's a terrific flight instructor. I go to him along with another fellow for my recurrent when I need it. And Freddie, he will always find a way to put me in a situation that I wasn't expecting, and then he'll sit there and wait for me to figure out how to get out of it. And one example of this is they put some new approaches in a few years ago here at Flagstaff, and I was up for my flight review, not for an instrument check. So I wasn't really thinking about looking at the new approaches. So Freddie says, well, we got all the other stuff done. Why don't we go shoot the new LPV approach? So I said, okay. And I pulled it out and cruised over there. And I start down the approach and I was nailing it. The needles were crossed. I felt great. And Freddie says, okay, wind just shifted. Let's land on the opposite direction. So we're on the approach, right, on our way down, and I start looking at the chart while I'm flying, and I'll be darned if I couldn't find the circling minimums. It turns out because there's a big mountain next to the airport, that particular approach, circling is not approved.
Okay.
So I had to figure this out on the fly, literally, and change. I had to complete the approach, miss it, and then shoot the GPS 3 approach back in the other direction to land. But he put me in this spot. And of course, the moral of the story is I should have looked at the approach more carefully first, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Freddie always puts everyone, no matter how experienced they are, in a spot where they have to figure out what to do. And it's such great training. And finally, I want to mention Jim Pittman, who's a member of NAFI and great guy. And he's the other guy I go to for training. The first time I ever met Jim was for a flight review many years ago. And Jim asked me about my flying and so on. But the thing he did, which I thought was so simple but so brilliant, and I've always remembered this, is as he was questioning me about what kind of flying I do and so on in preparation for the flight review, he asked me the question, Greg, what do you feel you need work on? What do you want to get out of today's lesson? And that's so simple, and I know some instructors ask it, but it was so straightforward. And I immediately, like I was doing confession or something, well, actually, Jim, there's these two things I'm just rusty on, and I think one was Chandel's, and one was actually reading the new METAR format at the time. And he said, okay, we're going to nail those two things along with all the other required stuff. Simple, but I got what I really needed out of it, which was the areas I was rusty, and we might never have tried those otherwise. Okay, long answer.
Well, 2 points to that. Your first story is the exact dichotomy between a new flight instructor and an or older isn't the right word, experienced flight instructor. A new instructor's like, oh, I gotta do something, and an old experienced instructor is
that's true.
Okay, well, we got another minute and a half before I got to do something about this. So I always found that interesting, because when I finally got to that point, it was like, okay, I've made it. I now understand what I'm doing.
It's a good feeling, and it's not the first day.
It's incredible. And to your point on, I think the second to last story about the approach, I had a similar experience. One of my mentors was flying around with me, and we were shooting an approach, and we knew we were going to go missed. And what I didn't realize is that he had arranged with the tower to give me the alternate missed. And nobody thinks about the alternate missed approach. So I'm, going missed, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And he goes, well, where are you going? I said, the chart says to do this, and this is what we briefed. And he goes, yeah, but they told you alternate missed approach. They what? What? I have never forgotten to brief an alternate missed approach ever since then, because I was completely dumbfounded by the whole concept of, oh yeah, that actually is there, and they can give it to you.
Wow.
So just I totally understand where you're coming from on those. So what's the most valuable non-aviation skill you learned from being a flight instructor?
Well, there's two of them. They're related. Everything about flying is about risk management, right? And we do the planning before we take off, and we're always keeping options open, what if, to have a safety plan, an out for everything. And I find that once you start thinking that way, it applies to anything you might do in life. You're starting a business, what are you going to do? Can't plan for COVID very easily, but what are you going to do if you have a cash shortfall, or if you get more business than you expected, or if and this applies to anything, even launching on a vacation, or it just changes your thinking that you're always prepared for some kind of a possibility of what you might, something goes wrong, what are you going to do? And then the related part of that is facts versus nerves. Most pilots, sometimes, I think every pilot occasionally, is nervous before takeoff about something. They're going to a strange airport, high mountain airport, the weather's bad, never flew this airplane before, just came out of annual. You got reasons why you're a little nervous. But as we all know, once you get going and you take off, you're fine. And the bottom line on this is that when making decisions, and I teach this aggressively to my students in these words, you need to separate facts from emotions. If the facts say it's safe to go, I know I have the skills to shoot this approach. I know the runway's long enough. Yes, the clouds are dark, but there's no thunderstorms. There's no ice. I'm nervous, but the facts say it's okay. I go. If the facts say it's not okay, I don't go. I try and leave emotions out of it. Gut feeling, someone who says, yeah, I just didn't feel right about the flight, so I didn't go. That's crazy, in my opinion. You'll miss half your flights. Now, the most dangerous situation, interestingly, is those people that, and of course, this is one of the personality types we study, the people who do not value the facts. They are the dangerous ones. In other words, the problem isn't nerves. The problem is the people who don't get nervous when they should. So if you look at the facts and you say, everything's working against me today, but I'm going to take off anyway, that's obviously a problem. Mm-hmm. But if you go with the facts and analyze it and say, all the facts add up, I've got the skills, the airplane's prepared, I can do this. Yes, I'm nervous, go. And that applies to a lot of things in life. And I think it's one of the biggest growth points for someone becoming a pilot is you realize that being nervous is not, it doesn't need to stop you from all the wonderful things you can try in life.
It's about managing it.
It's about managing it.
So what do you enjoy most about flight instruction?
I love the empowerment part of it. Most people who learn to fly have a dream of flight. They've always wanted to do it, or they think it's going to be the coolest career ever. And the idea of empowering people to achieve their dreams, to me, is just the biggest kick in the world. You have someone come in who can't do the radio, they're nervous, they'll never get all this figured out, can't do crosswind landings, and then you see them 2, 3, 4, 5 months later pass their check ride launch with their family on dreams they never thought they could pursue. To me, that's what it's all about. And it's one reason, by the way, that I've stayed in the general aviation level of instructing, is because that kick when people solo, that kick when they take their family, I suck that up. I love that feedback of giving someone that pleasure.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the main points of this entire series is to measure the commonalities between responses from everyone who does this with me. And I got to tell you, that aha moment has been one of the continuous points that people always bring up. And everybody just goes, oh man, it's the best feeling in the world.
It really is. There's a few people who never catch on to that magic. I think often it's because they don't instruct very long while they're headed somewhere else.
Right.
And I understand why they move on. But for those of us who keep doing it, it's a huge kick.
Absolutely. So what is your most interesting, scary, or fun story you've had with a student?
Well, there's an instrument flight. This is something I've written about, but I had a fellow, his name was John, but he wasn't you.
Right.
Instrument student, he owned a Cherokee Warrior. And this guy wanted to be a military aviator. He had been in the military, but not as a pilot. But he wore, I kid you not, this was out of Lafayette, Indiana, he wore a Nomex flight suit to his lessons. He wore gloves to his lessons. He did not wear a helmet. But he had, this guy was all about being a fighter pilot in his Cherokee. And he was an absolute fanatic on details. So this is not an exaggeration. I used to see him, I'd go out to the airport and he'd be under the airplane with a toothbrush cleaning the seams, cleaning around the rivets and where the sheet metal meets and so on. And then he had taken the instrument panel apart, parts of it off to repaint them because they were a little bit scuffed or a little bit worn, So, I mean, just an absolute fanatic. And he had just reupholstered his airplane. So anyway, we get ready to launch on this instrument cross country. And John brought along his son and his son's buddy. They were both probably 14, 15 years old. We flew to Kalamazoo. The weather was not hard IFR. It was real easy IFR. We flew to Kalamazoo, your home area, and we went to the museum, which is called?
Kalamazoo Air Zoo, which is also where the NAFI headquarters is.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
See, I haven't been out that way in a long time. Well, I don't think, if NAFI was there then, I wasn't part of it.
We were.
But, okay. So we land, we went through the museum, which was great. And then there was a bowling alley across the street. We ran over there, grabbed a hot dog. We got in the plane. We took off for home. By now, the weather had deteriorated, and it was good, solid IFR, perfect for this mission. It wasn't dangerous, but it was like 600-700 overcast the whole way. We're in the soup. And this guy, John, flew just like he dressed. He was by the numbers, by the book, never missed anything on the checklist, always perfectly under control, no needle moved at all. I mean, the guy was really impressive. So we're flying along, we get back to Lafayette, we're shooting a VOR approach into Lafayette, which of course, this is pre-GPS, so step down fixes. We cross the VOR and start down to the first step down, and one of the boys in the back, apparently these bowling alley hot dogs combined with the turbulence and being in the soup,
Oh, no.
one of the boys started throwing up in back. And then the other one started vomiting. So this is a mess, right? John, I don't know if you can see me here, but John turns around, right? He's holding the wheel. He turns around like this and starts yelling at the boys because they're being sick in this back seat of this pristine airplane. And we immediately rolled into like a 90-degree bank and plummeted right down to or through the step down fix. And I had been sitting there like this because this guy was so good. I never had to touch the controls. And by the time I untangled myself and grabbed the controls and regained them, we weren't in danger. But if he had been alone in the plane, they would have been goners. He was so thrown off by the kids vomiting, he was unable to complete the approach or land the airplane. I did that. It was one of the 2 or 3 scary things that's ever happened, because as I think we all know, most of the time the student errors are pretty predictable. So most of the time, as you've got some experience, you're not sitting there wondering what they're going to do. But this was an interesting one. And after we landed, I said, John, aren't you kind of glad that happened? And no, you know, I just got the reupholstered, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, but you saw there that you can't stop flying the airplane when something happens. Yeah, I guess you're right. So we had a little talk about it. And I felt like he got something out of it. But as I was leaving, he said to me, hey, Greg, do you know a good spot to get seat covers?
No.
So he hadn't fully absorbed the lesson. But that was scary, and it was educational for me as well as him. You just don't know what the trigger might be for someone to flip out. And if you can identify that trigger early during training so they don't find it out themselves, you've actually done something.
Well, and it reminds me of a similar situation. I always tell my students, if they're on a check ride and God forbid something goes wrong and the examiner gives them the opportunity to continue, always say yes unless you have a really good reason to say no. And the reason for that is A, you can't fail the check ride twice on the same day. And B, it gives you the opportunity to take those feelings you have, ball them up, and throw them behind you and continue. And if you can do that, then you've really made something out of sort of a poor situation, because you've learned that you can make sure that you're going to make it back. You've learned you can continue in a difficult situation. And I think that, like you said, is a huge lesson to understand.
And they often learn something about themselves when that happens, right?
Absolutely.
In other words, that they were able to continue, solve the problem or redo the maneuver or whatever. And then suddenly like, you know what, now I know what I'll do under that I'm going to be okay.
Exactly. It's something, I mean, it happened to me when I was a student, and it's something that I'll never forget, which is why I try to make sure that I pass that on to my students so that they understand. So in your mind, what quality or skill makes for an exceptional flight instructor?
Well, you can probably see this thread from all the way through. I think it's all about empowering your student to be PIC from day one. To me, that is what makes it exceptional. Yes, they can do the maneuvers. Yes, they know the material, but they take responsibility for the flight and they can make decisions. And another part of that is to understand that people learn differently and that you may have to teach them differently to suit the way they learn. But it's got to be all about empowerment, recognizing their concerns and involving them in all flight decisions, so that there's never a point where I, as an instructor, am saying, we should just do this, without involving the student in that decision directly. And just a little example of that I like to do. We've all experienced where a student will come out and find a nick in the prop or a wrinkle in the skin somewhere on the airplane, a cracked piece of, a cracked fairing, something that's minor. And they're like, is this safe? Now, our tendency is to say, sure, no problem, this is common. But if you can tell they're really concerned, it's actually worth saying, why don't you go grab the mechanic and have him or her come out and take a look? Because now you've empowered this person, if they see something they don't like, not to blow it off, to ask the question, even though you know it's safe. You want them to do that. And that is going to save their butt many times in the future if they do it. So I think an exceptional flight instructor makes the student PIC all the time from day one.
I think that's great advice. I absolutely love that. And for example, in what I do, especially when a student is trying to determine whether the weather's good enough, you give them the opportunity to look at the weather, make the analysis, and come back and tell me. And I've had students where they've done that and they've said, yeah, it's fine to go. And I'll let them make that decision. I'll let them go pre-flight. And the entire time I'm going, okay, it's going to rain in about 3 minutes. See what happens. And if it does, then I kind of go, okay, well, what happened to that weather report that you got? And if it doesn't, usually I walk out to the airplane and that's about the time where I go, all right, well, let's have a conversation here on decision making. But it's so much more profound to let them do that than to go to them and say, yeah, the weather's not good enough, we're not going to do it. Well, what did they learn from that? So I think your advice on letting them be PIC is extremely valuable.
Now, the other side of that is obviously there are going to be occasions where they're going to say, I don't think it's safe today, but you know it is. Mm-hmm. So here's a chance to have a discussion among equals about it. Well, let's talk about this a little bit. What are the risks today that you're concerned about and so on. So now we got two equals talking to each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that, again, they're being PIC, I'm still imparting the knowledge. I can have a discussion with them, but I'm never blowing off their decision or their concern. We address it. And frankly, if they're still nervous about it, even after we've discussed it, we probably shouldn't go.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Okay.
So what aspect of flight instruction best prepared you for what you do now?
Well, as most people know, I'm mostly involved with writing now, to a larger audience. And I'm a big believer in what's now called scenario-based training. And I learned a long time ago that if you can present the scenario of a situation, or if you have a story to tell that illustrates what the possible outcome of a certain decision might be, that's the best way to convey to a student, to involve them in the thought of what might happen. And so this is not something I thought about back then, but as I got into the writing of my Flying Carpet column, for example, which is stories mostly with lessons, this is something that I had developed as a skill, and I could take it with me under my arm to the magazine and write about it. So, like I said, not something I realized at the time, but I now know that was something I brought with me that I learned.
So as a part two to that then, how did you utilize that time to transition into what you professionally do?
Actually, there's kind of a funny story to the transition. I had been instructing a tremendous amount for quite a few years. I learned in 79, as we discussed. I became a CFI in 79. And I was instructing a lot, but I was also flying for my own business. And then I got a corporate job flying in Navajo. Down the line, I flew for regional. So there's a certain point where I felt like I was sort of done instructing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was tapering off of it. And I thought, at that point, I had already done the Turbine pilot manual. And I thought, you know, it would be really cool to share with others what I've learned since I'm getting out of this. And I wrote the Savvy Flight Instructor, which of course is about succeeding in the business of instructing as well as keeping your students motivated and so on. In other words, not about how to do maneuvers, but how to address the other issues of flight instructing. So of course, when that book came out, you may not know this, John, but Sean Elliott was executive director back then. And before the book was published, Sean was one of the people I asked to read it to see, you know, for input. And NAFI gave every member a copy of the Savvy Flight Instructor book for several years. He bought a large quantity. I'll never forget, Sean's such a cool guy. You know him, right? Or do you?
I don't think I do. I don't know if we've met.
He's a great guy. He's over at EAA. Sean called up one day and said, I hate to ask you this because I'm a little uncomfortable about this and it might not be appropriate, but do you think the publisher would mind if we pre-ordered a couple thousand books to give to our members? And I'm like, I don't think they would mind, Sean. But a lot of the folks who are watching probably, if you've been in for a while, you have a dusty old copy of the first edition from that period. But anyway, the reason I tell that story is that, of course, instead of terminating my CFI career with this book, it opened up a whole world of other things. My column, teaching for NATA, National Air Transportation Association, did flight training business success seminars I taught for, and the Master CFI thing. All these other things happened. And so, of course, I've spent my whole career doing it now.
Incredible. I have a copy of that book myself. So I loved it. So if you could give a new instructor one piece of advice for success in the profession, what would it be?
Well, if you've learned one thing about me in this interview is that I never have a simple answer to a simple question. It's back to the empowerment thing. And you can see this runs through the advice that I got from my mentors and everything else. So empowering your student to be pilot in command, that they can make decisions and handle the thousands and thousands of passengers who may ride with them in the future, especially if they fly professionally. I want them to be confident and competent in making decisions, and that they'll handle whatever comes along. So I've got a couple points I'd like to make on how I think, and this is something I tell new instructors. How do you make your student PIC? Some of these we've talked about a little bit already. Involving them in every decision, we've already discussed that. Making learning and flying fun and rewarding. You know, if you love something, if you love a sport, if you love to play a game, you will do everything to excel at that sport or that game or whatever, that career. And so, to me, this is one of the sad parts about a lot of people who go on and fly airlines and so on, is a lot of them, you see that enthusiasm, they kind of tamp it down to seem professional. And one reason I've stayed in flight instructing is I thrive off that stuff. But if you can make flying and learning to fly fun, you're really empowering your student. And an example I'd like to give on that's a negative example of it, there's a fellow I know named Bob Purcell, who is actually headed toward his CFI right now. When he was taking his instrument training out in New Hampshire, there's an instructor shortage there, like everywhere. The CFI he had been using left, and he got a CFI who had just retired from Southwest and was extremely experienced, sharp individual, had kept the CFI alive probably through seminars and FERCs, through FERCs all these years. In any case, he hadn't been recently instructing. So they take off, and for the first time that Bob had experienced, they flew an IMC. They climbed up into the clouds. They climbed through the clouds. Bob is flying the plane. They break out on top, blue skies, that high that you get when you clear the clouds. And Bob says, my God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And the instructor shut him up. The instructor said, we're not up here to sightsee. We're up here to work on the skill. And you can't be looking out the window. And it just crushed the student, right? He called me up afterwards. Now, to his credit, he didn't say, I'm going to quit. He just said, I'm never going back to that guy again. But we all know people who would quit, told that. And that learning moment when he says, this is incredible, what an opportunity to say to him, this is what it's all about. It's going to be tough doing this instrument stuff, but you can do it. And this is what it's all about. And then you can see where he's going to go. You can completely control where this person's going to go with your demeanor. The value of a pep talk can't be overemphasized. You never want anyone to leave a lesson dejected because they did poorly. If you can, you'd like to repeat the maneuver or whatever they're having a problem with. But you got to have a talk with them. You got to make sure they're excited about coming back. They don't feel bad about themselves. And in fact, this is why I started this Facebook group, the Student Pilot Pep Talk group, because every one of us has experienced somebody who had a bad landing or something, or went into a spin inadvertently or whatever. They come out of the lesson, they're ready to quit. And a 5-minute pep talk that we give them makes the difference between whether they come back next time or not. So I think that's so important. And as part of that, every instructor, in my opinion, should post a learning plateau out of the flight instructor handbook by their desk, so that rather than just talking about the learning plateau, everyone's going to reach it. We know that. And we say, hey, this is a learning plateau. And it's so common that it's right here in the flight training handbook. Here it is, posted on the wall. Look, after a series of lessons of improvement, you reach a level where you're not getting anywhere for 4 or 5 lessons of that. Now it's not them personally. It is everyone encounters this. You and I can handle setbacks if we know that everyone has trouble with it. But if we think I don't have it in me to do stalls, I got to stop flying. Okay. Celebrating accomplishments is a big, big deal. Not only should you do something special when they solo and when they get their private, post it on Facebook, give them a certificate, definitely cut the t-shirt, do that stuff, let other people know, make a ceremony out of it, because people thrive on that. Plus it also is good marketing. If their friends, if you put it on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever, their friends see it, they might come to you next. But some of the lesser accomplishments, like lesser because they're not official FAA accomplishments, are actually even bigger for the student, like the first time they make a greaser landing. We all know that thrill. At minimum, bring them into the office and make a big deal out of it, or take them to lunch, make a big deal out of, so-and-so, Jane just did the most amazing landing. She's been working on this for weeks, and now she's got it nailed. She may have a setback or two, but she nailed it today. I just can't emphasize enough how important that is to keep people going. Are we doing okay on time?
I think we're doing okay.
All right. A very quick story. So we live next to the Navajo reservation. And so we've gotten to know some Navajos pretty well. And they have a ceremony, which I just think is the coolest ceremony. It's called the Baby's First Laugh Ceremony. So when a child is born, the various family members and friends will try and get the baby to laugh. And whoever gets the baby to laugh first throws a party. And everybody comes to celebrate that this baby has now entered the community socially, right? I mean, the laugh is that first response we all wait for when we're changing diapers, we just get a laugh. And to me, these accomplishments are their baby's first laugh kinds of accomplishments. They're huge, even though they're not formal or official. Okay. The last 2 things here. let your students make mistakes and touch the controls as little as possible. Like Bob Vetter did with me. Every time we grab the controls, we defeat the confidence a little bit of our students if it's not done gracefully. I mean, obviously, sometimes you have to. Sometimes you say, I'll demonstrate. But you want them to make the mistake if it can be done safely, because that's the best learning moment. If they screw it up while they're at the controls, now they're like, oh man, how do I solve this? That's the perfect teaching moment to train them. But you don't want to touch the controls. And you and I chatted informally one time. My brother Alan had a flight instructor one time who tried not to touch the controls, but had a real problem keeping his hands off of them. And over time, he had developed this habit where every time like Alan would do a maneuver, the instructor would reach for the controls and then he'd slick back his hair. And then he would do it again. And this happened repeatedly through the flight. So it went from funny to Alan didn't fly with him anymore. Okay, and then finally, I want to say that I like to challenge my students to find me in errors. This all comes back to the empowerment of the PIC. I'll say to them, look, I'm not perfect. I don't know everything. Anytime you think I might be wrong, please raise it and we'll discuss it. And if you catch me in something where you're right and I'm wrong, and odds are you will, I'll take you to lunch. In other words, I want to reward them for questioning what I and you and their fellow students tell them.
I think that's all great advice. I think that each and every one of those things embodies the idea of a good flight instructor. I wish that I could show this video to everyone, because I think that those things are great examples of what makes someone an excellent instructor in this profession. And with that, I thank you for being a part of this, Greg. And I know that you have some projects going on right now. You want to tell us a little bit about those?
Well, I'll mention a few of them. A couple things that people might not know about. Well, first of all, the books, we've talked a little about the books, but Turbine Pilot's Flight Manual, we have a new edition out, Mark Holt, my co-author, and I. So 4th edition of that is out, and it's great with a lot of improvements. So those of you who are teaching Turbine or learning Turbine, that book teaches all the principles with no formulas. That was our goal. And then the Savvy Flight Instructor, if you get that book, be sure you get the 2nd edition, because that's the new one with all the social media and so on. It's a couple of years old, but the first one came out in '98. So you don't want to get the first one, get the new one, okay? And then
Greg, real quick, shameless plug. NAFI members get 20% off of ASA. So don't forget the discount if you're going to order those books.
Yeah, and while we're talking about that, if anybody wants an autographed one, you can buy them off my website. You won't get the 20% off, but if you want an autographed one, you can do it. My latest project is podcasts. I've got 2 episodes out. It's called Greg Brown's Cockpit Adventures from the Flying Carpet. And it's available. You go to my website, gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. It's on YouTube. It's on all the usual podcast channels, Apple, Google, and so on. And I'm proud of it. I hope you'll give it a listen. As with my column, it's all about telling a story, usually with a lesson or two buried in there. And then one other thing I'd like to mention is a lot of you know that I've been involved with aerial photography for a long time, selling prints and so on. And my magazine column for years was illustrated with my photographs. And I have started something in the last few years that's been pretty popular called Pilot Achievement Plaques. And if you have a student who's soloed or earned their private, and often this will be a family member saying, what could we do to help, to celebrate this occasion, take a look at my site at gregbrownflyingcarpet.com and take a look at the Pilot Achievement Plaques. What I do there is I get the photograph from, of the pilot, first solo, the day they're getting their certificate, whatever, and the details of the flight, and incorporate those and written on this date at this airport and so on, incorporate that with a photograph of their choice in this beautiful semi-gloss metal wall plaque. It's 10 by 20. It's a nice big plaque. It's just a really wonderful gift, and they're very affordable. I think it's $125. So they're getting something real special. And that's enough projects to keep me busy infinitely.
Yeah, as a subscriber to the podcast myself, I recommend it to anyone watching this video right now, because you won't be disappointed. And I do have one final question for you. I happen to notice your tie, and there's got to be a story behind it. So spill?
Well, many of you who know me at all know I always wear bowler ties, but this is a special one for the occasion. This is a Hopi healing hand tie. This is a Hopi symbol of the healing hand for healing people that goes back through the centuries. And here we are in the middle of COVID, and I thought, I'm going to wear this and send some good vibes out to all my fellow instructors, and that you and your students and your families remain safe through this period. This is my little way of projecting that. So thanks for asking.
Oh, absolutely. And there you have it, folks. Our most recent edition of the NAFI 10 Question Challenge with our guest, Greg Brown. Thank you so much for joining. If you're not a NAFI member, www.nafinet.org will allow you to subscribe and join. And thank you very much.